All right. Hello and welcome to the video. My name is Wade Smith. And in this video, I'm going to be discussing some facts surrounding King David, some very suspicious facts found in the Bible, by the way, the suspicious nature of the facts, anyway, about King David. Because everyone is familiar with the story of David, who's read the Bible anyway, is familiar with the story of David betraying Uriah, the husband of Bathsheba, on the field of battle and having him murdered and then marrying her illegally in both cases, obviously. Everyone's familiar with that story and the fact that that was murder or masterminding the murder anyway. But not everyone realizes that David literally murdered several hundred people in the Bible, and the author doesn't even necessarily make any bones about the fact that David murdered several hundred people in the Bible. Some of them individually and personally for very specific greed or lust reasons, and some of them on the battlefield, but with no just cause for warfare. And I'll give examples of them, and it's usually involving a woman. Also, it's usually involving a woman who's he's illegally married or about to illegally marry. All right. So, his first wife, according to the story anyway, is Michal, the daughter of King Saul. And what does he do to earn her hand in marriage? Uh, and by the way, I'll get to another thing too, because there's another story that where David blames Michal and basically divorces her, but keeps her as a slave, basically. And in response to him dancing naked before the Ark of the Covenant, and she was actually correct. What he was doing was illegal because in the book of Leviticus, you are forbidden to worship God while naked, and forbidden to appear naked before on any high place or before the temple of God. It tells you that in Leviticus. And by the way, he was not wearing an ephod. The text says he was naked, that David danced naked before the Lord. And she despised him for breaking the commandment. And then he cursed her and divorced her, but kept her as a slave locked up in a room, is what happened to her. But how did he get her to be his wife the first time? He went and killed, I think, 200 or 300 Philistines and circumcised their dead bodies and brought the foreskins as trophies to King Saul, is what he supposedly did to get her as his wife. Well, that's murder. By the way, that is mass murder and genocide. There's no just cause to go kill those men, and it's probably never even happened. It's just a stupid story that's been made up about David for some reason. But even if it did happen, there's no just cause to kill those men. That is just genocide. Let's go kill 200 Philistines just because they exist and circumcise their dead bodies and bring me their foreskins, and then I'll give you my daughter to be your wife. All right, so that's how he got his first wife, is he murdered 200 people for no good reason other than they existed. The way he got Bathsheba is he arranged the murder of Uriah, as we all know, and that's the only murder that he's ever actually rebuked for in the Bible. Ironically, even though I'm about to prove that several other murders were committed by David, either directly or indirectly. He murdered the husband of Abigail with no just charges. The only thing the text says is that Abigail's husband was, quote, evil, and then it's like, well, what were the charges? You got to commit specific crimes to be worthy of death, namely murder, rape, blasphemy, that sort of thing, witchcraft, homosexuality, that sort of thing, according to the Torah. Well, they never brought any charges in the text anyway against her husband, and then lo and behold, David marries her. So he murdered that guy and stole his wife and just brought false charges with no evidence against him. Later, suspiciously, King Saul is killed, but according to the story, David didn't kill King Saul directly because David supposedly refused to kill King Saul himself, even though supposedly King Saul was a lunatic at that time. Well, a certain Philistine knew that King Saul and David were enemies, and he supposedly, according to the story, killed Saul, and then he came and disarmed himself and went before David and told David that Saul was dead. So then David murdered that person just for appearing before him. It tells you that in the text. So why do Christians and Jews think so highly of David? that you killed an unarmed man who was a messenger in a time of war and just telling you that your enemy was dead. And so you murdered him just for showing up. Why do people think so highly of David? He's one of the most genocidal maniacs in the history of humanity, if he even existed. You wouldn't let this man out of prison in your sight if he was alive today, and you sure as heck wouldn't let him write books about religion or preach in your church if he was alive today. He was a mass murderer. And he was a polygamist, which Christians claim not to believe in. He had at least 14 wives in total that we know of, and all of them, except Michal, came from murdering their husbands. And again, she was married to him because he murdered 200 Philistines. So, where do people get off thinking David is the best thing since sliced bread? I don't care if he did write half the Psalms and Proverbs. It's preposterous. Do you really believe that that is a saved man that is going to be in the real heaven with the real God in eternal bliss forever? Because that's what people think heaven is anyway. Is a place where there's no crime, no crying, according to the Bible, no crying, and God shall wipe away all tears. Apparently, we're going to be translated into angels or something, and then constantly in a state of worship of God. But then supposedly evil people weren't there. But then we're supposed to believe that David is there, even though he murdered at least 200 people, as I've mentioned, for no good reason other than they existed. So you think David is going to heaven, but you think, somebody that told a little white lie and doesn't believe in Jesus is going to hell, for example, even though that person might have otherwise been the best person around. That it doesn't make any sense. So you have to be justified by good works, and you have to be damned by your evil works, as both Ezekiel and Isaiah said. And if that is the case, David busted hell wide open. I'm sorry to tell you, and so did Solomon. Matter of fact, it pretty much tells you that about Solomon, because it tells you that Solomon ended up forsaking God and worshiping Ashtaroth, which Ashtaroth is a human sacrifice cult, similar to Baal and Moloch and Chemosh worship. And it tells you that God hated that. So I'm positive that Solomon busted hell wide open, and his father David busted hell wide open. But you guys think that David is the greatest thing on earth. Christians and Muslims and Jews do. Explain to me how you can justify the claim that you think David is saved when he pronounced a fourfold penalty on himself in response to the prophet rebuking him. And the fourfold penalty never physically came to full fruition in his lifetime, even though 4 of his children did die. But David didn't die until he was 70 something years old, supposedly, or 70 or 70 something years old, supposedly, which is hard to believe because very few people lived that long back at the time that supposedly said. But he supposedly lived to 70 years old, and on his deathbed married yet another virgin girl, but supposedly never had sex with her and died on the spot laying next to her, according to the story. So what does any of that have to do with salvation? And how could this person who is not a single murderer, but a multiple dozen, multi-hundred time over murderer, supposedly be saved? That is an outright lie. There is no justification for murder in the law. There is no forgiveness of murder in the law. You were told to be stoned to death the very day that you were convicted at the mouth of 2 or 3 eyewitnesses. And it tells you thine eye shall not pity them for murder. So Where do people get off thinking that David is such a great thing in the Bible? It is ridiculous. And Solomon is even worse. If he did see God face to face and hear from God ear to ear, mouth to ear, after dedicating the temple, then the fact that he later turned and worshiped every false god, as the text says, of all of his wives that he never should have married in the first place, including a human sacrifice cult, namely Ashtaroth worship. If it is true that that actually happened, then that person is, believe me, that person is in the worst case imaginable and is in the worst place in hell or whatever torment God could imagine against him and will never come out of that. If that story is even remotely true. And Christians and Jews think David and Solomon are literally the greatest thing in the Old Testament for some reason. It is preposterous that you teach this to children as some kind of good thing.